Yeah, kia ora everybody, thanks for coming. My name's Belinda Borell. My family are from the Tauranga Moana area. My dad is a Borell from Te Puna, little place before Tauranga. And my mum is from Whariki, but she was a whāngai into a Ngaitirangi kaumātua and brought up in Mangatapu. But I was born and bred in Manurewa, South Auckland. I did my master's research around the diversity of Māori identity for young people from that urban environment in South Auckland. And through that I realised I was asking the wrong question, and the question wasn't really what it should be about what it means to be Māori, but what it actually means to be Pākehā. So from within a Māori worldview, I started to look at what societal privilege looks like and how that has an equitably important role in how we understand disparities of all kinds, but particularly health disparities. So that's what Mandy and I were investigators on an HRC funded project to look at that. Then my PhD was really my kind of learnings that I got conceptually, theoretically, epistemologically, and culturally, I guess, from going through that project. And the PhD was kind of another iteration of some of those monocultural type processes and trying to sort of shine a bit more light on that. So that's kind of where I was at. And so my PhD was really about that. And I'm going to sort of cover a bit about what I actually looked at, and then really look at one of the main ideas that I examined in my PhD.
Awesome.
So bear with us if the technology is a bit, and I use a few artworks, so that should break the monotony of PowerPoint displays.
So shall we go?
Yep, go. Okay, so yeah, click us through there.
Oh.
So just some acknowledgements. These are just three men that I lost that passed away during my PhD. The middle one is my dad. He died in 2015. To the right is one of our kaumātua from Manurewa, Alex Whaipu. He died a few months after my dad. And then to the left is my old Māori high school Māori teacher, Hori Pōmana, who died about a year and a half ago. And then, as you do, after I've submitted my PhD and before I had my exam, three more of my really close relatives died. Josie Donahue was my favourite cousin from Christchurch. Coralie Titua was one of my favourite cousins on my mum's side from Tamapahori Marae in Tauranga. And then just before Christmas this last year, my favourite auntie, Motu Cooper, passed away as well. So I just like to acknowledge and invite us to think about those as we go through these kind of big milestones, those of our loved ones that support us but are with us in spirit. Okay. Didn't cry that time, so that's good.
Yeah.
So next one, just the aim of my thesis was to explore the conceptual, theoretical and methodological issues involved in the study of cultural, racial and ethnic privilege in Aotearoa New Zealand. So I got asked in my exam why I don't have a particularly strong class analysis in my thesis, and that's entirely on purpose. Because I feel that far too often class is given as a fallback for, I think people are more comfortable with the class analysis creating disparities than they are with a racialized societal analysis causing disparities. That seems to sit easier with people, and I often found that was starting to subsume the discussion, when actually what I wanted to talk about were the racial disparities that exist within and without that paradigm as well, because I feel it's often missed and excused and argued away in defence of a class analysis. So I purposefully have kind of downplayed that and left that to people with more knowledge of that issue. Yep. So just sort of the objectives of were to really document the learnings of the Privilege Project. As far as I'm aware, there are very few examples of research that's focused on the more advantaged and privileged angles of society. Most of our research is focused on those who experience disadvantage, and that has some. I guess there's some logic to that, because the logic being that the more investment made for those who seem to suffer the most, the more chance that the returns will be far-reaching. I think that's important, but we also, I think we need to keep a grasp of the idea that those disadvantages don't exist in a vacuum, and that people are disadvantaged because other people are privileged. And we want to have an honest discussion about addressing disparities. We have to look at the advantage side, the privileged side, as well as the disadvantaged side, if we're honest about actually addressing disparities and not just demonising or victim blaming or bootstrapping people who do experience disadvantage, I think. So that was sort of one of the goals of the Privilege Project. I really wanted to challenge the preconceptions about what Māori research should study. So we do have this tendency for Māori controlled research to really only focus on Māori content, on Māori topics that are of specific or immediate interest to Māori communities. And I thought that's limiting, that can limit a worldview. A worldview is not a worldview if you only apply it to yourself. So you do have to apply a worldview to things outside in the world that may or may not have direct relevance to, or immediate relevance to, your community. And so I thought, although privilege definitely does have relevance, the perception is that that's a less travelled pathway, I think, for Māori epistemology to gaze at. And I wanted to try to cement that a bit more, to show that kind of Māori controlled research projects on non-Māori subject matter is really valuable to improving equity. To argue for the expansion, not only the expansion of Kaupapa Māori research methodologies in their definition, but to argue for the expansion in their application, to examine how ignorance, silence and suppression is critical to hegemony. So I talked, in my abstract, I talk a lot about what privilege not only offers to the privileged, but also in what it withholds and what it ignores and keeps silent and suppresses, because I think that is just as critical as well to maintaining hegemony as is what is offered in terms of privilege, and to kind of explore how that kind of ignorance, silence, and that kind of structured forgetting is the wording that's kind of used in the literature, how that is actually undermining the social order for all people, not just the disadvantaged. It actually does have detrimental effects on the privileged as well. And so challenging that ignorance is actually about improving the social order for all people. Okay. I'm just going to keep it tight because I can go on forever. Okay. So just sort of basically, I've left the link at the end of the presentation if you need some help getting to sleep at some time and want to have a go at reading it. So there's an introduction chapter that just sort of lays out the literature. It was actually a really interesting process, because as I got to the end of my PhD, I realised, because I did it part-time, and so I was at the end of 6 years, and I realised I need to go back and refresh all my literature. And it was actually really astounding the amount of new, not new concepts, but how concepts had been developed and really explored. Things like that were just really at the beginning phases when I started. Things like historical trauma was, in the 6 years that I'd done my PhD, had really developed as a area of literature. Social ascription for ethnicity, being socially ascribed as opposed to self-identification, that had really taken off in an area. And so I was really kind of interested in looking at that. And from that process, I then wrote another chapter in my thesis, which was to do a privilege equivalent, to theorize a privilege equivalent of historical trauma. So we can't look at current disparities and make logical assessments about their historical beginnings without looking at the historical beginnings of those who experienced privilege, and that hasn't, to my knowledge, been done explicitly before. So I wrote that paper in a couple of days while I was sitting in the Manurewa Public Library reading up on historical trauma literature. So anyone who is doing their PhD, I always advise to go back and look at where the literature is at, because you just, after you've done your data and you've thought about things so much more, a lot of that literature reads new, like you see new things in it. So that was a really useful process to me. So I outlined the major ideas are set in 5 papers. 3 of the papers have been published, and 2 others, since this was done, I've been hit back for one of my papers. So I'm looking for a home for that one. And then the papers are kind of followed by discussion, references, blah, blah, blah. So just the kind of major findings, really I just wanted to put 3. I just put 3 arguments together. The first one is that Kaupapa Māori epistemologies have enormous potential to New Zealand innovation. So how we think about Kaupapa Māori research and theory, who we consider to be a Kaupapa Māori theorist, what subject matter we apply Kaupapa Māori theory to. I think there are well-trodden paths, and you could ask any one of us to answer those questions. We'll say something about Smith, and we'll say something about Bishop, and the list of quotables is a very succinct, concrete, almost kind of list. Anytime you see a student writing about their chapter about Kaupapa Māori methodology, there's a general list of about 10 core citations that most people use, and I think that's really wonderful. But those theorists themselves argued in lots of that work how Kaupapa Māori would develop and what it would look like in the future. And I think I really took from some of their examples about where Kaupapa Māori should be going and how we should be applying it, and almost taking it for granted, if that sounds terrible, but to actually start that a base for examining a whole range of topic areas, not just te reo revitalisation, not just disparities research, not just things that we tend to think Kaupapa Māori illuminates the most. So that got me into thinking about what a Māori worldview may illuminate for non-Māori subject matter, because I think there's some interesting and really innovative potential available there. That silence, ignorance, and suppressive forgetting maintain cultural hegemony to the detriment of all. So a large part, we all know that privilege is, has major effects on the disadvantage, on those who don't receive it. So we all get that, but it's a lot less study to look at how privilege actually undermines certain aspects of the privilege themselves. And so there's a cost. There's a cost to the privilege to experience that. The kind of societal advantages that they get, and that's not, we want to move away from this idea that the harm is equivalent, because of course it's not. I mean, patriarchy is not harmful to men in anywhere near the same way it's harmful to women, but it is still harmful to men. So that we shouldn't exclude those understandings. So I spent a fair bit of my research looking at that, and ironically, at the end of 2016, while all the craziness was happening with the American presidential election, one of the biggest health stories at the time had come out about a vast increase in mortality numbers and raw mortality figures for white people in the US, aged between the ages of 50 and 54, when all other ethnic groups' mortality numbers were declining. This group was accelerating right off the charts. And so it was used at the time as an example for why there's no such thing as white privilege. And actually, when you actually examined the causes of death of those rises, the 3 causes that it came down to that were mainly driving that increase were poisonings from drug addiction, cirrhosis of the liver from alcohol addictions, and suicide. So those are all deaths that have been driven by not only a loss of power, a loss of status and opportunity, but a loss because they didn't argue, Black people and Latino people had experienced the same economic and social decline, but had not responded in anywhere near the same way. And so the question got asked, well, why would that be? And it seemed to me that only a privilege analysis actually gave a definitive answer, and that what was lost was not the social and economic decline alone, but what was lost was a sense of societal expectation that you mattered and that you would be looked after. Now that is something that black people never had. So so there was this resilience that the disadvantaged had to declining economic conditions and the political what would you call that? Not ignorance, but that, you know, the political indifference that they didn't matter. Someone doing their dishes.
Hi.
Sorry, someone out there's got their mic turned on and you're either unwrapping the most delicious
Chocolate bar, but you're not sharing with us.
You're not sharing or you're doing your dishes. Can you just make sure you mute your mic, please?
Sounded lovely. So that to me was a really clear example of how privilege was the very thing that gave these non-college educated white people a sense of superiority, was the very thing that was actually set them up to be unable to kind of cope with the socio-economic decline and the political indifference that followed that. And then when then Trump came along and actually played into that whole idea by further demonizing people of color and poor people, and it worked. And so I think that to me was a perfect example of the danger that privilege poses to all people, white people included. So this idea of what's repressed, what's silent, what's kept ignorant, and what's forgotten. I think it's not forgetting in a passive sense. It's what's structurally repressed, and suppressed and forgotten, and how important that is to maintaining cultural hegemony, I think. And so that our focus has tended to shine a light on disadvantage and keep privilege hidden, and that's in one of the ways that so when I talk to people about what it means to be mainstream, what it means to be Pākehā, people really struggle because that's hidden to them. They don't know that. They know what all the disadvantaged, marginalised identities look like, because those are all marked and talked about, and we all have an idea and have an opinion about that. But when you ask about what's in the middle, people really struggle to find an answer, and that's because those things are kept hidden and forgotten and not talked about, not thought to be things that need to be illuminated. So that was sort of some of the things that I struggled with, that my participants in the Privilege Project really struggled with. And I think that has intensified victim blaming of individuals. Now, it's victim blaming, I don't know, not a big thing of the left and the right, but it seems victim blaming gets very overt on the right, but it's not lost on the left as well. It's just reframed as this kind of bootstrapped narrative. But the emphasis is still on the people who are experiencing the harm, and so that does almost inevitably tend to intensify victim blaming. And I needed that's a result of the structural and institutional elements are often hidden from us. And when you look at the role that the media plays in that, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they're kind of key players in doing that. And that these represent a wāhi ngaro. I want to talk a bit more about wāhi ngaro as one of the ideas that I focus on. And that those wāhi ngaro literally means lost place. So it marks, it sort of is our word to explain these silence, the ignorance and the suppressed forgetting in our society. That's sort of a word that I'm using to think about those ideas. And that's harmful to everyone, even the advantaged. But that it's not, all over, that cultural hegemony can and is often challenged and can be changed in a whole range of ways. And so the whole idea of the thesis was to really broaden our discourses and about the discourses that we have about disparities and how we frame those, the methods that we use. If we've got methods that can measure privilege, measure disadvantage, then we have measures that can measure privilege. If we can measure, we have all these measures for what we would think would be an appropriate minimum wage by definition, then we must have measures that can measure an appropriate maximum wage. Those things all exist. It's just that we don't look to focus on those ideas. We want to make poverty history. We don't think about making privilege history. And so I think these are sort of some of the ways that we want to try to broaden how we speak and how we understand disparities of all sorts, but particularly in health, I think. To kind of try to illuminate the cultural specificity of societal institutions and values. And I think, you know, when you get down to what does it mean to be the dominant group, you know, that's these ideas of what's normal. And just because things are unmarked doesn't mean that they're not culturally specific. And this is kind of where you get that, you know, special treatment discourse about Māori things, about Māori interventions, Māori initiatives for progress are classed as special treatment. Well, you can only think it's special treatment if you think everything else is culturally benign. And so there's a whole, you know, area in which I think we need to look at making the cultural specificity of our societal institutions much more visible. We'll all have Pākehā students who will have said to us, you know, you Māori are so lucky you have a culture, because we don't have a culture. You know, and we are flabbergasted by that, because we look around at university and think, well, what the hell is this? What is this university if not Pākehā culture, right? So it's that it's unmarked. So an assumption that things are universal often tends to hide the cultural specificity of those institutions and other kinds of societal concepts that we, you know, hold so dear. I wanted to kind of encourage a bit more honesty in the role history plays in current disparities, not just on the trauma side, but actually on the privilege side. And I think there's far too less of that. And it's interesting now, you have a lot of historians trying to give a bit more balanced accounting of history in that way, and they're often seen as biased towards Māori. There's been a huge narrative about that, about Vincent O'Malley, for instance, who's written about the Waikato Wars. So I think, you know, yeah, that role of history in our current disparities is just about putting things in context again. Just the stuff about expanding the definition application of Kaupapa Māori theory, and to really encourage cross-disciplinary collaboration to strengthen Kaupapa Māori. And I'll talk a little bit more about that next. Okay, so the idea that I wanted to really explore here is this concept called wāhi ngaro. So, and forgive me, te reo Māori experts and lovers of te reo Māori, I don't know how to do macrons in my PowerPoint, and I don't have that on my keyboard, so apologies. I will try to sort that out before I make this available to anybody else. So wāhi ngaro has a literal meaning. So ngaro means lost or hidden. I mean, all these Māori concepts are incredibly more meanings than this, but this is sort of what you'll find in the dictionary. And then wāhi is a place, a portion, an allocation of some sort. So it's often kind of literal meaning is it's a lost or hidden place. But wāhi ngaro has very deep spiritual connotations, and when you listen to Māori whai kōrero and mihi whakatau, usually you'll hear the word wāhi ngaro in reference to the dead, to people who have passed on. Death being kind of the ultimate unknown place, unknown space. So you'll often hear the words wāhi ngaro mentioned in that context. So it has this kind of supernatural, almost divine connotation to wāhi ngaro. And I wanted to look at that a bit more. Now, if you know me, some of you who know me will know that I have a twin brother. My twin brother is an artist. He's I think he's really great. I think he's really great artist, but quite well respected artist and writer and curator of Māori art. And so I've been around Māori fine arts scholarship for quite a lot for most of my life, and been exposed to Māori fine arts artists and writers and theorists. And what struck me is that many of our fine artists don't consider themselves scholars. So we think of our Māori artists, as people who titillate our senses with their beautiful artworks, but we don't often think of them as theorists, as researchers, and as doing some of the finest kind of scholarship. And so I wanted to kind of explore that a bit. As I was listening to certain the theorists that I'll be talking about, and I heard her talk about some of her painting practice, and what she talked about sounded to me exactly what I had been reading in my privilege data, and I was astounded that her fine arts theorising about her painting spoke in such dramatic and clear ways to me about data that had nothing to do with Māori people, was about Pākehā privilege. And so I wanted to try to marry those two things up, and I'll try to do that today. Bear with me if we all get lost. We might all be in Waingaroa by the end of it. Okay, next one. So if we just think about ko whaiwhai scholarship, so Nigel gave me this definition of ko whaiwhai, which I think is really interesting actually. So ko whaiwhai is the unique Māori visual language that incorporates the convention of positive and negative space to produce design and pattern. So if you go to the next slide, this is sort of some examples of how, so if you look at Ngā Mōteta, so if you look at these patterns, all of the coloured spaces, or if you're looking in the top pattern, the white markings, those are what's marked, but they're revealed because of the negative spaces that are behind them. So both of those things work together. And so often when you look at ko whaiwhai, you look at tuku panels, what is not coloured often features as importantly in the meaning of the pattern as what is marked. And it was the marking in unmarked and marked spaces that really spoke to me in terms of what I was seeing in my privileged data. Okay, so Kuriti Warirewiri is the artist and scholar that I was particularly interested in. She has a very well established and well known Māori artist, painter. From the very kind of her very earliest, she was a student at Bay of Islands College under Buckman, and a lot of her paintings have been about the treaty, about mana, about religion. She was very, a lot of her work is about religion and spirituality, and also about the kind of powerful presence of wahine Māori and women in general. And so the mural behind her, if you think about what we've just talked about in terms of ko whaiwhai being a Māori visual language, the kind of conversation and the work that's happening behind her is the exact kind of complexity I think that we find in kind of, if you're studying discourse, you're doing thematic or discourse analysis of words and text anyway. And so it's this kind of these are the ideas that I wanted to kind of express. Now when I said to her, could I want to come and talk to you about your epistemology work? She was very shocked. She said, oh, do I do that? Am I doing that? So there is this internalization that these people are artists, when actually they're incredibly sophisticated theorists and scholars. And so I really wanted my work to highlight that, and that's a pathway that's less travelled, and I think it should be embedded more. Okay. And so this is one of Kura's ko whaiwhai murals called Tineo, Tineo. And if you think about the kind of complexity of what's marked and what's unmarked in those spaces, these are the kinds of ideas and the kind of depth and sophistication I think that we can apply to discourse and to qualitative data. Okay, yep. And so ia rā, ia pō, so if you just click, this is the photo that I used in my thesis. So this is when, so the carving at the top, the painting at the top there, is actually her interpretation of a carved wooden carved lintel that was found in, the work was, the carving was called tangone. So it was found in a lake in the far north. It was a very shallow lake. This farmer bought this land and he drained the lake. And this carving was found, and it's one of the earliest examples of carving in the country and it was incredibly special because it was one of the first pieces that you could tell by the way it was carved, it was created to be seen from all sides. So it didn't have a back, if that makes sense. It wasn't sort of placed on something. It stood over, would have stood over a doorway or a pathway of some sort, and it would be able to be seen from both sides. So I thought that was really apt, that it can be seen from all different angles. You can be looking at the same thing and have completely different perspective on it. And so this is kind of where she explicitly starts to explore this concept of wāhi ngaro. So the figure in the middle is what we call a waka koiwi. Now, that's often classed, defined as a burial chest, but that's actually incorrect. As I started doing more of the searching around some of the artistic art theorizing, there's also been a real reclamation of artistic terminology. And so waka koiwi is not a burial chest because we didn't bury our people. It's more appropriately and more accurately, a waka koiwi is a bone repository. And so that makes it kind of a lot more sense. So bones were placed in it, but not buried. So there's this whole reclamation of our art terminology, just trying to get the definition of korowai. You wouldn't believe how it's actually not simple or so there is a whole language and a discipline and a really high level of expertise amongst our artist scholars that I think is completely under-regarded and underestimated. Okay, so here's Kura herself talking about wāhi ngaro. So wāhi ngaro, the connotation is that it's fixed, that you can't know what is there, and she kind of saw it quite differently. So she thought that wāhi ngaro was something in yourself, that place that was lost, or a place in yourself that has a hole or that needed to be filled, that was sort of waiting to receive that sort of stuff. And so rather than being a fixed idea of something hidden that can't be seen, it was actually that it's an untapped potential, that it's a cavity that can be filled. And that kind of spoke quite nicely to me in the ideas if we want to address privilege by illuminating hidden spaces. So that was sort of something that was quite interesting for me. So we click on, get there. And so here's some of the data, and I think this is kind of where these were some of the passages that were speaking to me when I was hearing Kura talk about wāhi ngaro. So here's Joe thinking, oh my gosh, when we've asked him what it means to be mainstream. It's this. So he does argue what he thinks it is in the first couple of lines. It's husband and wife, 2 kids, something like that. But then, as what always tended to happen was people could give you a couple of kind of really common rote answers, and then all of the defining of what the middle was done in implicit opposition to what it was not. So they would quickly then say, well, it's not being on the breadline or in poverty, but it's not being flashy. This whole idea that we just go about our thing, doing their thing, that was very common, and you see that a lot in Pākehā discourse that's being done in other work. And if you go to the next passage, this one's really long, so I'll put it over 3, but poor Mandy had to sit with this lady and have this discussion. So it was it's a very long quote, but I thought it summed it up really, really well. So we've asked her, and we didn't use the wording middle class New Zealand, we asked what does mainstream mean, and the middle part they kind of came up with themselves. So people say, oh, it's middle class white New Zealanders. I actually don't think that's the case. All the bolds, by the way, are mine. They're not shouting it or I don't know, that's just sort of me trying to help y'all out without having to read everything too intensely. So she thinks that mainstream actually does encompass Māori with a particular worldview, but it doesn't necessarily encompass Māori with a strong sense of their culture. I actually think that mainstream is not necessarily colour specific, but it is fundamentally conservative. Next one. So that one, Māori can be mainstream if they're not too Māori, or they're not Māori, or they're not culturally Māori, which I think is really quite a powerful statement. So again, here she says what it is, that these are people that have jobs, have children, but then of course immediately she starts to then do this oppositional implicit framing. I was also kind of really reminded of Orientalism and what Edward Said was talking about in terms of when you make explicit statements about others, you make implicit statements about yourself. And so these are kind of the explicit statements were all these implied oppositional elements towards what was mainstream. So they don't commit crimes, they don't push the boundaries of political thought. Then there's this, we're just getting on with it. That comes up again, that mainstream are not rocking the boat. They're not radicalised, but they're not kind of pushovers either, you know. And then the next bit, I think, is where she kind of really, if you flip the next slide, this is where she kind of really starts to kind of argue what would be mainstream. So she'd say that anarchists are not mainstream, but neither are libertarians or ACT Party supporters. They're not. Greenies are not necessarily mainstream. Extremists, I guess, are not mainstream. Anyone pushing the envelope of political thought are not mainstream. And I guess feminists would not be considered mainstream. And so if we click to the next one, what that really made clear to me was that privilege is this idea of wahingaro being, that privilege is wahingaro to the privileged. Well, there's nothing new in that. I mean, the entire privilege literature is based on the idea that the privileged don't necessarily know, or, you know, that those normal parts of society are hidden from them, or not overt or illuminated. So it still is something lost. But I think in those last passages about to be considered mainstream, feminists can't be feminist. To be mainstream, feminists can't have to forego feminism. Anarchists can't have anarchy. You know, I think that libertarians to be mainstream have to give up libertarianism. That to me speaks about wahingaro as something that is forfeit. So something has to be given up. Something has to. So it's not lost in a passive sense. It's given away. And I thought that was actually something that was quite new to how I understood the idea of wahingaro. And I thought that spoke a bit more clearly to Kura's idea that wahingaro can be filled. And then the other thing was that many of the Pākehā participants seemed quite deeply dissatisfied with the limitations, that they couldn't get it out, and they couldn't explain it, they couldn't argue about what health disparities were without kind of giving in to these kind of racist and victim blaming tropes. And they knew they were doing it, and they couldn't they didn't have the discursive resources to give another account. And they seem to be quite dissatisfied with that. So I think that kind of speaks to the idea that wahingaro is a space of dramatic potential. And that really, I really did then want to argue that seems to me to be really active encouragement to what Margie Weatherall and lots of other people have been doing about creating alternative discourses, and what Tamaki treaty workers and the treaty worker area have been trying to do for a long time, to create alternative patterns of language that people can use to, you know, explain and be more satisfied with explanations they give about the disparities that they see. And so those silences and that kind of repressed and structured forgetting can be addressed. Okay, am I near the end? Okay, so that was kind of the idea that I'd wanted to talk about, but I did want to just talk about some of the procedural learnings that I took from doing this PhD. And I suppose one of the key things for me was I found it really difficult to get published. And not just being published, but the breadth of publication. So I found it really hard to be published outside of Indigenous journals, or outside of real critical kind of areas. So, and that was kind of frustrating to me, because of course Indigenous people all over the world, and Māori in particular, but Indigenous people everywhere, they know all the ideas that they don't need to read my thesis they just live these ideas. I feel my thesis ideas need to be put in front of the privileged. And that is like a bloody, how do you get that into that space? And so if you click to the next one, I can come back to that. So if you click to the next slide, so this is sort of where I sort of felt that I felt I was in a different kind of intersectionality. So we've got our anti-racism and whiteness area. There's lots of, you know, writing and expertise in that. We've got a lot of writing and expertise in the privilege and colonisation kind of area. And we're getting a growing expertise in Indigenous epistemologies. But we don't, it's this middle kind of tiny circle in the middle here. And I just really felt that, you know, that's, and all of that exists within an academic discipline. So any academic discipline could be, you know, good or bad on any one of those, mostly bad on any one of those three things. So I felt when I tried to get published, when I had reviewers, you know, I was getting reviewers from every paradigm except those that kind of subset in the middle, and so I felt there was a really general low level of expertise about the kind of intersection of where I was coming from and what I was trying to say, and so I felt that in some of my reviews they just didn't get it. They might have got the anti-racism stuff, they might have got the colonisation stuff. They generally did not get the Indigenous epistemology stuff. And I think that this issue did affect where you know, which journal would think that was a good paper to have. You know what I mean? You see what I'm sort of trying to say? The reviewers you get, the assessors, the funders of what you see. And so I don't, that's a pretty crude drawing, but that is kind of how I sort of felt about it. Anyway, if we go back to the previous one, yeah, so I felt that the expertise is kind of ad hoc, you know, so you got people who are experts in one particular area, but often I felt because I was an Indigenous, writing from within an Indigenous paradigm, that just completely threw people, and I don't think they really knew, well, their reviews told me they didn't really kind of accept where we were coming from and what we were trying to say. I think there's still a really high level of personal discomfort with the idea that racism is so important in the disparities that we see in society, and I think that discomfort is quite rife within the academic community. So some of my reviews, I would have a go at trying to pull apart what was their professional queries or concerns they had about research and what was really just their personal discomfort with the idea of how important racism is in terms of how our society is structured, and I think that's still pretty high. I was really kind of taken with the rise of white fragility as a concept within my PhD. That's really kind of taken off, and I see a lot of students are very interested in this idea of white fragility. Many more of them probably practice it, but you know, it's still there's sort of a bigger critique about that. I've been I was telling my two interns, our two Navajo students when we were coming down, they asked me if this was my first time speaking, and I said, oh no, well, at the end of my PhD I counted up how many talks I had given about privilege, and it was 72.
Wow.
So I had to actually stop, you know, say no to a couple of years to say no, I can't do any talks this year, so I can actually finish getting this bloody PhD done. So I think in a way there's some acknowledgement of that intersectionality. So I just get inundated with people wanting me to come and speak about these ideas. The reviews have been coming thick and fast. You know, there's a need there, but it's a wahi ngaro to the academic pursuits in some ways, because they don't want to, they're uncomfortable with it, but they know they need it. It's a weird kind of paradox, I think. I think there's a general increase in the general awareness of privilege in health. I think that's increased a lot, and I mean, health, I do believe that health, and particularly public health, is a sector leader in terms of understanding the way that these structural and institutional impediments affect health. And that the PhD is still a pretty bloody monocultural process, I have to say. We had some, you know, I had some real concerns about the PhD exam. They originally said that I had to be private and I wasn't allowed to bring my family. Well, that just kind of And I'm at Massey University, who claim they're a treaty-led organisation, you know. And then I went to try to graduate, and I only wanted to graduate in the Māori ceremony. I didn't want to go. I think the Pākehā ceremony makes me feel like it's a funeral, so I only wanted to go to the Māori ceremony, and I couldn't. So I've had to put that off till next year. So I think there are lots of ways in which the actual PhD process is still quite very monocultural. Anyway, that's just sort of some of the learnings that I'd had from doing it itself. Okay, next one, and the next one. Oh, and so just where I'm at now, so I was really lucky. I got the Hohua Tūtangaihe postdoctoral fellowship from the Health Research Council. Hohua Tūtangaihe is a kaumātua, was a kaumātua from Tauranga. He's from Rangiwaia Island, which is in the Tauranga Harbour. So I feel really honoured and, you know, really humbled to have been awarded that fellowship. And that's to really kind of pursue this privilege idea. And I'm looking more at the interpersonal interactions with healthcare professionals. So we know that healthcare professionals, irrespective of intent, irrespective of whether they're trying to be, you know, racist or not, nothing about that. But irrespective of their intent, we know that Māori Pacific people receive different care in a whole range of ways. So we know that there's discrimination happening in the racism end of it, and I wanted to look at, is there discrimination happening in the privilege end? So are some people, how does that kind of work in a professional setting amongst healthcare professionals and patients, if you will? I'm going to trial a new method in terms of illuminating privilege. So we've been using Q-sort, which is a kind of a sorting of statements, particular statements, a good way to measure attitudes. So I'm looking at that too. We've used that method to look at racism and Māori health, but not to look at privilege. So I'm going to be looking at that. And my wider idea is I want to think more carefully about how racism and sexism, but largely how racism affects societal perceptions of the poor and the kind of regard that we have for the poor. And so that was, yeah.
Cool.
So that's it, and that's the link. If you need some help getting this link, you can download the thesis.
We'll get permission to put this up on the site as well, so people can have access to it. Right, take a deep breath. Gosh,
yeah.
You're great. Great speaker you are.
That wasn't a bit confusing, but
no, not at all. It was fantastic. So we've probably got some questions out there. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
We're going to go back to so we can see each other.
I think you just have to do that. Or go participant.
Okay, so questions. You can all turn your mics back on when you want to ask a question.
We're all in the wahingaro. Sorry.
I'll get started and make a comment.
Thanks, Avril.
Okay. Anyway, kia ora, Binny, first of all. That was fantastic. Have I heard you? And I haven't been to 72 of those talks, but probably only to enough to be on the fingers of one hand, actually. So it was really nice to hear you talking about this work at the end of the, at the end of the project, and so articulately. And I love that whole conceptualization around the wahingaro. That sounds fabulous. And I'm really looking forward to reading the PhD, which I have yet to do. But I was really, one thing I just was noticing about, the whole, the way that those of us who are privileged have such difficulty articulating anything positive about it. And that line you said often came up, they just go about doing their thing. And I thought it's actually a very telling, isn't it? In terms of a kind of a frictionless life, like you just get on with it, you have the power, you've got the capacity, nothing's getting in your way. So, but that is quite, it does kind of illuminate a lot structurally.
It does. Yeah, it implies that
whatever.
Doing anything is a choice too. You know what I mean? Like you choose to want your land back, and you choose to want to speak your language, and you know what I mean? It's kind of whereas you just let things be. And I think that really plays into the kind of get over it, discourse as well, that, just don't speak up. And it is always quite interesting to me when Pākehā, say for instance, the people in the red zone of Christchurch. Now, every now and then you'll hear some of them say things like, well, now we know how Māori feel. You know what I mean? So when Pākehā are disregarded, there is this kind of automatic revelation about you saw it here out in West Auckland when they sprayed for all those moths and all those people got really ill and no one cared that they didn't want that spray in their community. So I don't know, I just think, it is really telling about the kind of, we can just go, we go about our thing because we can just go about our thing, I think is the kind of subtext there. And some people, they, it's not quite that simple.
Right, we've got some more questions out there, or you're still sort of taking it all in?
Any artists? Are there any artists?
Any artists out there?
Kia ora. Thank you so much. I'm thinking of the name Borell, actually. We've got some Borells in our whakapapa, and I'll do some research on that.
We'd all be related.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
Just thinking of what Avril said and your response to it, and I'm a treaty educator, and some of the rhetoric around the time of the signing of the treaty of an expectation of Māori were that things were just going to go on as they had before. We just keep doing our thing. And it's fascinating to hear those statements within what you have discovered in the conversations you had with your research participants, that's exactly what they're saying in 2018. Most interesting. So kia ora.
Kia ora.
I'm interested, Belinda, and I'm obviously going to have to read your thesis as well. But the idea about structured forgetting, what were some of the things that you looked at around that?
So the kind of there's actually quite a lot of forgetting literature, and some of the papers that I read, I think Connaughton was one of the main theorists, and he had 8 kinds of forgetting. And there was there was also a fair bit that I read about South Africa. So as South Africa has ended the apartheid era, there is this kind of ongoing societal process about what things do we remember, what things are best left forgotten. Often you see that in countries that are rebuilding from a war or from genocide, there's usually some event that's happening about how societies restructure themselves. And in my thesis, I looked particularly at Anzac Day and how Anzac Day actually, for the men that were there, is a trauma. That was a trauma. And yet the trauma narrative that we have now is the opposite of what you would expect trauma, the feelings of trauma to illuminate. So, and I noticed that as those men died, the reverence for Anzac Day changed. So it started, what you read is that it started as a very solemn occasion. Now it's sort of taken, each year it takes on this, remembered. You know what I mean? There's this reconstruction of it all the time. And then you sort of look at that compared to the rā whakamaumahara, which is about remembering the land wars. And so I tried to juxtapose those two things about, so we want to remember war up until a point. And then there's the structured forgetting. We don't want to remember that, and I think that's a really good way of how society works. And the whole point is to maintain a identity, maintain a national identity. And so the remembering and the reconstructing and the reframing of Anzac Day, I think, goes on to keep reiterating this idea about New Zealand culture and what New Zealand identity is really about. That, to me, that was kind of one of the examples that I'd use.
That's a great example.
Whereas you look at kind of, some of the land wars overlap with the First World War, and yet our society has this complete structured forgetting about what those are and what they meant and how they impact on who we are today. And so that was sort of one of the examples in which I think remembrance and forgetting are highly structured and constructed things. And that was sort of one of the things that I wanted to kind of, and that you know, those are very, the conversations are very limited conversations about what that means, you know. And I don't think that's just about, you know, race, because I mean, one of the biggest proponents of Anzac Day coverage is Māori TV. So it's not, you know, that it's this kind of way that the nation uses Anzac Day to cement the identity markers that it thinks are important.
I read something the other day actually about that, and I don't know if it was you that wrote about it, but the person was saying that the first Anzac really was the Māori land wars, because Australia and the colonial Australians and the colonial New Zealanders worked together in that, and that sort of puts a really different spin on it, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, have we got some other questions up there? I feel like a radio reporter and speak
to us.
Yeah. Where are all you people out on your desktops?
Kia ora, one of those people on the desktops. And I'm aware that I didn't actually say my name when I introduced myself, so my apologies. I'm Karen Nee, and I'm based here at Otago. So, but really interesting, Belinda, in terms of what you're talking about. And I found it really powerful, your kind of analogy with patriarchy that has, you know, implications for men, I mean, disproportionate implications for women. And I wondered if, and I suppose I was also connecting, you know, the harm of privilege with your comment about white fragility. And I just wondered if you can talk more about both those ideas, which I think are really interesting.
Yeah. So white fragility is this, I mean, people are generally uncomfortable talking about racism when it's discrimination, but when it's privilege, it seems to take it to a whole nother realm of discomfort, because it's almost like it goes against human nature. No one wants to think that there are things that they do that other people can't do, that there are things that they are allowed to do, there are things that, you know, there's ways that they get treated that other people can't get, because that really cuts to the heart of, you know, those ideas of fairness and equality that are really so important, and particularly in Pākehā identity, that we are all the level playing field, that thing, you know, this, and particularly this idea of fairness. And I think that, you know, Pākehā distort that idea, you know, I mean, the fairness is manifest, you know, with all the kind of ignorance, you know, so not having Māori wards is fair. You know what I mean? But that's only fair if you ignore the whole kind of historical context. You know what I mean? So I think privilege really comes, you know, headbutts that idea of fairness. So people aren't inclined to want to believe it. But also it's this. So I think part of white fragility is white people aren't practiced at it. They're just not used to it. They don't have to think about it. They don't think about it because they don't have to. They're not made to. It's not on the test. It's not going to affect their, you know, whether they get that job or not. It's not going to affect what they have for dinner, whatever. And just not everybody can kind of say that. But also I think when you look at the white fragility literature, there's a few New Zealand examples that feature very prominently in that. And the ones that I saw were both written by Alison Jones and Kuni Jenkins about classes that they would have, and then they would caucus the classes. So they'd take the Māori Pacific woman and the Pākehā woman, and then they'd talk to them about, and they wrote a paper about the feedback that they got from that caucusing. And that was some of the very early, in the late 1990s. And that was some of the ideas that Robin DiAngelo, who's written the most about white fragility, those were some of the really key papers that she looked at. So you have Māori Pacific woman feeling quite relieved. Oh, great, we can sort of, you know, get things done. We don't have to be nitpicked. We don't have to be exoticized and have people ask us ridiculous questions. And the Pākehā women were incredibly upset. how can we learn anything if they don't tell us? You know, why we should all be learning together. The very kinds of same things that you hear from Pākehā people when that kind of thing goes on all the time. And so the ideas about white fragility is white people's, you know, feel entitled to be comfortable. They don't like being uncomfortable about, you know, this stuff. And if you just stop talking about it, you know, we would stop feeling uncomfortable. And that's really, you know, that defensiveness is quite key. They feel that people of colour, that it's that they're just empty vessels, and it's people of colour's responsibility to tell us about what it is, what racism is. We don't have any individual or collective responsibility to pull our own load in that way. And so it can be very draining for people of colour in that area. If you look at the kind of cultural advisor capacity person, generally has a job expectancy of 2 years, and then they've had enough of that, you know, because that's such a draining process to continually be the educator for people.
Who don't want to learn.
Who don't want to learn. I just came back from a seminar in Australia called Teaching While Black, and one of those presentations by Dennis McDermott, if anyone wants to look it up, it's really quite interesting. He has articulated 4 types of recipient of anti-racism messaging, from the openly hostile to there's kind of 4 variations about what you kind of get. And one of the strategies he talks about, if you get an openly hostile audience, is about performance management, or you just want to be able to let these people get the information so they can manage their jobs. And to be honest, when I do a lot of my talking about privilege and anti-racism, that's my bottom line, you know. So and it's not because I think the audience is necessarily hostile, but performance management and being good at your job is an incredibly important pillar in Pākehā identity. So Māori identity, what you do, you know, you can take or leave it, but for Pākehā identity, it's the first thing they ask themselves, what do you do? So who you are as a worker, who you are as a professional is incredibly important to them. And I find that with Pākehā students. If you tell them you're going to know this anti-racism stuff and you're going to be a better society, well, they don't give a shit about that. They don't care about that. But if you tell them, oh, if you do this anti-racism, you're going to be a better professional, you'll be better at your job, you know, you might go up the ranks. Oh, you watch them perk up. They want to know that kind of stuff. Because so I think you need to understand the identity of a white audience and what they think is important. And that's not about, you know, diluting the message, but it is about, you know, trying to sow the ground as best you can, so the seed you leave there. And I think another part of that is to show that those are structural impediments. When we talk about privilege being undermining for all people, then white people have an investment. You know what I mean? If you say, oh, it's just about making black people better or making Māori people better, white people, for obvious reasons, might not be that interested in that. But if you say, well, actually, there's lots of ways in which privilege damages you too. So, you know, if we only think domestic violence happens in brown homes, and then you as a white middle class lady are experiencing it, and people don't believe you because you don't look like a victim of domestic violence, you know what I mean? Well, that's a disadvantage to you. If you're then, you know, if you think about that much more broadly, the majority of our drug addicts, our alcoholics, our victims of domestic violence, perpetrators of domestic violence are all Pākehā. But our perception in our mind is that those are brown people that are experiencing that. Now that has effects for the stigmatisation of people of colour, but it also has effects for people who are not stigmatised in that way and in others. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think I mean it's a real growing it's a really growing area, white fragility. I think it's, but I think also the more that white audiences understand that what they're feeling is, you know, common, that they're not strange for, you know, and they're not racist for feeling uncomfortable and ill-practiced about this stuff. I think the more that we get that idea through the writings of and the literature around white fragility, I think you might see some more acceptance of that.
Thank you very much.
Have we got? We sort of need to come to a close soon. Is there anyone else is there anyone in our room actually other than me? No, good. Is there anyone out there? Good. Oh, go say that.
Hey, Belinda, thank you. That was amazing. I was just thinking, because part of the challenge and the stuff that we're doing in Indigenous crime is around trying to deal with, you know, the discourse of representations and stuff that you're dealing with. And I think you're absolutely, you know, in terms of the path that you're taking and the way in which you're framing it is so important to what you're trying to grapple with as well. But I'm interested in, given the fact that much of what we're trying to do, there is this education aspect, it seems that there's a path that we might be advocating for, perhaps, around plurality, you know, plurality of structures, plurality of, and some of that's, you know, so the difficulties of imagining a plural society of some sort is around the fact that we're still very much monolingual in many of the dominant systems. So did you talk a little bit about some of that stuff in your thesis around, you know, sort of where we're going, you know, so that I know that there's a need to do this stuff, and it's really important in terms of illuminating privilege and so forth, but where's it going to? Like, are we going to advocating for some kind of,
What's the end game, you mean?
perhaps, I mean, I understand that the journey is just as important as where you're going, but you do need to be visioning some place we're going, you know, like in this, and it seems to me that we are trying to aim for some kind of system, whether you call it a system that involves a central state or you're talking about nation states, whatever, you know, because at the base level, most of us don't even know our neighbours, you know, and we're advocating for things like getting to have conversations, understanding privilege and stuff like that. But you know, like it seems that we're advocating for some kind of plural society of some sort, and sort of interested in whether you've had any readings.
I don't know about plural society, because I don't think the society serves Pākehā particularly well necessarily either. You know what I mean? Or the other thing I think about when we think about whiteness is that it makes assumptions that all white people are the same, and there's these incredible stratifications amongst white people too. So I'm not sure if I've understood exactly what you're asking.
No, I mean, it's difficult because
I do think more governance should happen at a community level, but I think the environmental decline will decide that for us. I think that's going to subsume anything that humans themselves are trying to create. The environment will dictate what future human society will look like. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's part of the challenge is trying to articulate this stuff. And
do we want separate systems? You mean?
Not necessarily. It's an epistemological question as much as it is a, you know, because in order to imagine something, you need to be able to speak more than one language, right? And so to think about something in a pluralistic way, you have to be able to imagine things in more than one worldview kind of framing. And so sort of thinking about things in what I understand to be Kaupapa Māori, Tikanga o Whasamo, or other frameworks, there is a languaging and a being, right, which is quite different. And we know the difference because we live in these multiple worlds, right?
Yeah.
So in order to get to beyond a sense of what might be privileging one over another, you need to have access to some kind of experience of more than one, you know, in order to imagine how to get out of it. So I'm just intrigued because it's stuff that we're trying to grapple with at the moment.
So you're wondering what? So you're saying Pākehā don't have that, or?
No, I think if you live in a predominantly monolingual environment, the language dictates how you're going to think and frame things, right? So your structures are always going to imagine, because that's the limitation, it's mono. So if you then want to incorporate a bicultural treaty and then include other disadvantaged groups, that when you include the race issue, you're including different language frames within that, because that's how they carry their racial worldviews. That means that you have to be more than monolingual. You have to be able to experience life in these, you know. To then imagine privilege that would so doing something about now I understand filling that cavity. You know, now I understand some of the wāhi ngaro. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I got, and then what? You know, like so that's kind of.
So what would you fill the wāhi ngaro?
Where to?
What would we imagine?
For what purpose?
For
Yeah.
what, you know,
Yeah.
ultimately, where are we heading to? Is that something that?
Geez, man, I've got no idea.
I
don't know. I'll leave that to you. It sounds like you've got a better idea than me.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I know Melinda Weaver's just published a book about mixed identities in Aotearoa. Have you seen that one? I think it came out at the end of last year or the beginning of this year, so that might be. So it looks at some of those pluralistic sort of ways of being and thinking.
Yeah, and it's ways of being in the present too, you know, and that's a. I understand the importance of critique and I understand that, you know, there are finite spaces in which one moves, but, you know, there are societies that are multilingual, you know, and so having a sense of how do you move, I mean, the capitalist ideology has been so pervasive that it's, you know, so the economic question is really an important part of it, but you still got to imagine how it is you're going to move out of this kind of monostructural environment into what you're aiming for.
Well, we might finish with imagining.
That's another PhD.
I think it's a really good place to finish. So
Thank you very much.
yeah, thank you so much. That was just really awesome.